Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's dirty protest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Terminus Est Army of Renown, or Assault Force. The limiting factor there, of course, being that you cannot take any vehicles or demon engines in your list. You're pretty much just limited to infantry. However, the vast majority of the linchpin units you'll find in any Death Guard list are infantry, so it's not an incredible deficit to be unable to take those vehicles. However, I very much enjoy a bloat drone at the moment, so the Terminus Est Assault Force to me is a limiting factor for not being able to bring those, but it does make up for that with an interesting warlord trait, some spells that offer great utility, and some stratagems that allow you to do things that you otherwise just wouldn't be able to do in a typical Death Guard list. So let's take a look at those. So as we've mentioned here, you're not going to be taking any drones, haulers or crawlers, but you will get access to a warlord trait for Typhus, which I would say is sorely needed given Shamble Rot is pretty trash. So this is an aura of 3 inches. Enemy units of a leadership 7 or less within that aura range lose their obsec ability if they have it, and they also fail any actions they might be attempting to complete. So that's a great addition there in terms of playing the game, limiting the opponent's ability to score. But on top of that, you get +1 attack if any enemy is in range of that aura. And of course, Typhus is really only attacking in melee. Of course, the attack characteristic only applies to melee. So if he's in melee with somebody, he's got that additional attack, taking him up to the blessed 7 attacks. So of course, with Nurgle supporting that number there, you are sure to kill anybody that stands in front of Typhus. In terms of the spells, so not only will Typhus be able to have that warlord trait, but you can kit him out with these spells, or if you do favour the likes of Miasma of Pestilence and Putrescent Vitality as buffs, which are still great buffs to have in a Terminus Est list, you could slap these on your other psykers. You've got options such as -1 toughness for an enemy unit, but that doesn't stack with the contagion effects of Contagions of Nurgle. That is specifically worded. So whilst it does offer that -1 toughness at range, given you're not going to be bringing any of those heavy vehicle units, it may help with the likes of Blight Lords shooting combi bolters, maybe combi plasmas or melters as well. And of course, perhaps with those Blight launchers, getting a toughness 4 target down to toughness 3 at range allows that Blight launcher to wound on 2s. So again, there are still a variety of shooting profiles that could benefit from that at range, but it's not necessarily an auto take for me. I think there are other stronger options here. The next one would be a malediction that would limit your opponent's unit to charging no further than 6 inches, and they will be unable to re-roll that charge. Now, for me, this is a bit of a weird one, because whilst you generally don't want your opponent to charge you, depending on the units you're bringing, if you have a Blight Spawn supporting the squad that's getting charged, and they have the Relic Revolting Stench Vats, they can turn off the opponent's fight first and turn off their abilities that relate to them having charged. And so in a lot of cases, unless they have a fight last, they're essentially giving you the opportunity to hit them first. Depending on the quantity of units in that engagement, that could be all you need in and of itself. So I feel like limiting the charge roll is kind of counterintuitive in a way. It will at least mean your opponent doesn't charge onto that objective, maybe can't steal that off you for your turn, you aren't taking the damage from their melee attacks, and presumably then they are going to be close enough for you to move up and make a reasonably easy charge into them, and of course that will allow you to attack them first unless they've got any fight last effects again. So a reasonable pick there, but I don't think the most powerful option you could go for. Typically, I'm not too bothered about enemy units charging my Death Guard army. Normally, I'll set it up so that they might kill something, but my counter charge is going to be more dangerous to them, and that the trade should hopefully work out in my favour, even if they do kill a unit. So preventing them doing that feels like a counterintuitive play to me, but it's not going to be always wrong. There are certain units out there that you really don't want getting in melee range because they can really pack a punch. So for those particular engagements, it could be very relevant to limit that charge and essentially make it impossible to get in. The next there would be full rerolls to hit with a plague weapon when it makes an attack. So if you have got a lot of plague weapons in a squad for shooting, you might want to use this to be able to shoot and full reroll to hit with those. But there aren't an awful lot of plague weapons in terms of ranged options. You could combine that with the stratagem for bolters, for malicious volleys, which will change the weapon into a plague weapon for all intents and purposes during that shooting phase, so you can have full rerolls to hit on those attacks. But the main strength here for me is, of course, in melee. The majority of the army here are going to have plague weapons in melee besides the Poxwalkers, so giving a unit of Blight Lords or Death Shroud full rerolls to hit in melee is going to offset the hitting on 3s, failing on 1s and 2s. Getting to reroll all of those is going to look pretty nice. There is some direct damage options, which I don't think are particularly strong. 1 mortal wound to the target, and then 1 mortal wound to other units that are within 3 inches that are non-Nurgle units. So normally it's just going to be 1 mortal wound to an enemy, and 1 mortal wound if they've got anything else stood nearby. I don't think that's that strong. It could help you maybe chip another model off a unit and perhaps make it fail morale as a result, but I just don't think spreading damage is ever the right way to go unless that's what your whole army is doing. Realistically, you want to be removing a unit or chipping it down to the point where it's almost certainly going to fail morale or force your opponent to spend that CP to auto pass. So I don't particularly like that one. We've got reduce AP by -2, or reduce AP up to 2 less. I butchered the explanation on that one. It's like Armour of Contempt, but it's double the effect, and importantly, because of the way Armour of Contempt is worded, it doesn't stack with Armour of Contempt. So of course the Poxwalkers, which I'm sure you'll have some in this Terminus Est list, they don't get Armour of Contempt anyway, but for everything else, it's really just doubling the effect of Armour of Contempt. It's not a bad option to have, particularly if you're into some AP too. Taking that to AP 0 certainly isn't a bad thing, but the fact that it doesn't stack with Armour of Contempt and the vast majority of your options that you're going to be picking from having Armour of Contempt means this doesn't feel overly strong to me. Your Plague Marines and your Terminators and all of your characters are going to be on a 4-up to AP 2, so going down to AP 1, 3-up save, down to a 4-up save, or for the likes of Terminators, a 2 to a 3. So you're still going to have a reasonably good save against AP 2 anyway. Into those big AP profiles, you may well be glad of reducing it by 2, so there is a use case for it, it's just not necessarily the way I would go. And then we've got another spell there for some mortal wounds based off a toughness roll-off. So you add d6 to your toughness, so you roll a dice and add that to your toughness. The opponent does the same. If you beat theirs, you deal 3 mortal wounds to the target. If you double theirs, you deal d3 plus 3 to the target. So given it's based off toughness, you might want to use the -1 toughness spell to sort of get them reduced a bit already. But again, that kind of feels like 2 spells to attempt to deal up to 3 plus d3. Realistically, I think I'd rather just go for a smite and a plague wind if it's a horde squad, or a smite and a curse of the leper, or a plague wind and a curse of the leper. There are damage options there already, one that relates to toughness. I just don't think this adds an awful lot extra, and ultimately it can work out as no damage even if you've passed the spell well, because the opponent could just roll a 6 and you could roll a 1 and get no damage out of it. So ultimately, I don't think that's a great spell. For me, the 2 that I would be looking at here would be full rerolls to hit with the plague weapons, because you're only going to get that full rerolls in terms of Mortarion. So having the opportunity to dish that out, whether you do or don't have Mortarion, a second lot of full rerolls to hit is pretty nice, other than if you're up against something like Quins that are going to stop that happening. I don't know if that's just shooting for the Quins, but either way, there are armies out there that stop full rerolls to hit, so other than when you're up against those, it's going to be nice to have. And I think for the other one, I would probably either be on the extra -1 toughness just to help the shooting out a bit, or reduce the AP by 2. I don't think there are two clear options here. The full rerolls to hit is a definite pick for me, but the others don't necessarily feel better than the normal contagion discipline. Besides that, we've got access to some stratagems. Now, one interesting aspect of this is that we can pay command points up front to put units into deep strike that normally wouldn't be able to strike in that way, like, for example, Plague Marines or Poxwalkers. But there is a significant CP cost to that. Based on the total power level we're stashing away, we would pay CP. And if you put in multiple units away, you're very easily going to be looking at 3-4 CP, but certainly 1 or 2, even just for a unit or 2. And given that we are still going to have access to all the same characters and all the same vetted variant choices, I would already have a few CP earmarked for relics and warlord traits. I do think that warlord trait available to Typhus is worth a take as well. That extra attack and turning off obsec and failing actions can be very, very good. So for me, I think putting things away in deep strike just feels like a massive cost, because you have got access to Terminators. They can do that anyway. It just seems a shame to pay for it, when there are some great stratagems in the Codex, and there's some other great stratagems available to Terminus Est that I would really want to use instead of deep striking Plague Marines. On that note, we've got 1 CP for all Poxwalkers get +3 inches to their move characteristic. That's almost doubling their movement, taking them up to the blessed 7. So of course, Poxwalkers moving 7, whether it be just turn 1 or the first few turns, means they are going to be able to expand out onto the board and touch into objectives, being able to spread that sickness perhaps the same turn because they didn't advance, they simply moved further, but also to get out into the opponent and start trying to deal some damage with those Poxwalkers. Bearing in mind, we are going to be the Harbingers, so we are going to have access to both Wrathful Dead and Mutant Strain for those full rerolls to hit, and 6s to hit are mortal wounds, though 1s to hit are mortal wounds to the Poxwalkers. So of course you can either lean in and reroll everything that's not a 6 and take the ones you take, or you can play cagey and just reroll your misses and look to push everything else through as just normal attacks. So the extra 7-inch, extra 3-inch on the move there across multiple turns is going to allow them to get far further up the board than they would have otherwise, and I think is one fantastic reason to take the Terminus Est Assault Force, particularly if you're interested in running 40, 60, 80 Poxwalkers. You could even go so far as to run more than that, to be fair, but it is a lot of models to deal with. If you've not already got all those models, it could be a bit of a challenge just to get those table ready. And then the other stratagem that I particularly like, it is 3 CP, which is pretty expensive. However, it allows you to do something that just isn't a thing for the rest of the game, really. 3 CP, revive a full squad of Poxwalkers from a board edge 9 inches away from enemy units. So it essentially allows you to deep strike a dead squad of Poxwalkers. So there is a heavy incentive there that if you're going to want to use this, you should at least have 1 full squad of 20, so you can maximize the value that you're bringing back. Once that squad has been wiped out, you can then pay your 3 CP, bring them in from a board edge. Typically with the way Death Guard play, you want to sort of carouse the opponent back into their half. Some faster opponents with, flying vehicles, Quins do spring to mind, may well be able to push out into your half as well by flying over your lines, but unless they're able to do that, you should be able to get fairly close up the board, just 9 inches and a bit away from the opponent with that additional full squad. And again, if you are then willing to combine that with the additional movement range, you can push right up into the face of the opponent and make basically an unfailable charge with that full squad. So for me, the deep striking and the fact that we're paying for warlord traits and relics does very much limit how the power level of Poxwalkers can come out of the Terminus Est list. But I think if you're including a Tallyman in there and you're otherwise being fairly reserved with your CP, you can really juice up Poxwalkers, make them a significant threat for the opponent, bring them back from the dead so that the opponent has then got to fire off more and more of their resources into the Poxwalkers, and that's just going to allow your Plague Marines to get where they need to get to. Same with your Terminators and your characters. If you bring in Blight Lords, you've got that bit of a shooting option. If you've got your Death Shroud in there, they've got reasonable shooting at close range, in my opinion, particularly if they're backed up by Arch Contaminator for those full rerolls. So for me, it's more of a question of whether you have the CP to do it all, rather than whether you have the tools to do the job you need to do. There are some great options here overall, and I did really enjoy the games I played against it. It did feel very thematic. Just the trudge of infantry coming towards you. But overall, it isn't really my cup of tea. I don't mind the Poxwalkers. I do include them in most of my lists, although I haven't for a recent list. I've gone more Plague Marine heavy. But ultimately, just losing the drones feels like a massive payment to me. And getting these buffs on Poxwalkers and these additional spells and Warlord trait just don't offset that desire for me enough to get rid of my drones. But if you are willing to get rid of your drones, your haulers, your crawlers, you can certainly get a lot of work done with the units available to you still. But as I've said, it probably comes down more to where you're getting that CP from. The Tallyman, obviously going to be a great fit. A Psychic Interrogation secondary, possibly a great pick as well. You can regenerate CP from there if your Tallyman's failing you, or you're just not bringing one. And otherwise, just making sure that whatever mission it is that you're playing, you are meeting the requirement to get that CP every turn. So some missions, it requires the Warlord on the battlefield. If you are planning to deep strike Typhus in that game, you may wish to reconsider, have them on the board, because that extra 1 CP could be the difference between your Poxwalkers getting up there and being a threat for the opponent, or being just too far away to be of concern, and your opponent, if they've got the option, shooting them off the board before they can really get much done. Well, that's it for me and the Terminus Est. Have you used the Terminus Est? Do you enjoy it more than a typical Death Guard list? And if so, or if not, why is it for you? As we've said, for me, it's the drones, but I appreciate there's a lot of other good units that are ruled out. And if you're a fan of those, I would love to hear from you. So thank you so much to everybody that gets involved. Really does mean a lot. But otherwise, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.